SLL Research Seminar Series. Today we have Dr. Matthew Petway. I think this is one of the highlights for the seminar. He is a visitor scholar and he comes from the University of South Alabama. He's associate professor in Spanish and in African American studies. He specialized in African spirituality, in literature, also in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. And today he's gonna delight us with a presentation about Manzano and the Crossroads and how this slave narrative in Cuban literature. I'm gonna organize a little, shall I just present? Just that you can see the presentation. African spirituality and the Black liberation in a Cuban slave narrative. With you, Dr. Matthew Petway.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is an honor to be here today. I'm going to make a quick adjustment with this. Please excuse me. I'm going to make something work here on my end. So thank you. It is an honor to be here today. I appreciate the invitation from Dr. Katia de la Cruz Garcia. And I am honored to be here in South Africa. And I would like to dedicate my lecture to the Cubans and the South Africans that fought against the armies of apartheid for the liberation of Angola. Thank you. My lecture today is Manzano at the Crossroads, African Spirituality and Black Liberation in a Cuban Slave Narrative. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. We don't need to cut this up?
You need to switch it on.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah, and there is, sorry, in your pocket.
Okay. I know when you were there was clear sound. Okay.
Sorry, you can continue. I'm just gonna close it.
Problem. No problem whatsoever. That's beautiful. My talk today is entitled Manzano at the Crossroads, African Spirituality and Black Liberation in a Cuban Slave Narrative. Juan Francisco Manzano mounted a horse under the cover of night to escape the Cuban slave plantation that had held him in bondage for nearly 2 decades. Fleeing on horseback from Matanzas to Havana exposed Manzano to grave dangers, possible disorientation from hunger or thirst, or even being taken into custody by slave hunting parties. Manzano entrusted the saints with his passage from slavery to freedom, as the final paragraph of his autobiography indicates. Manzano described it thus: Me puse de rodillas, me encomendé a los santos de mi devoción, me puse el sombrero y monté cuando iba a andar para retirarme de la casa. I knelt down and I commended myself to the saints of my devotion. I put on my hat and mounted the horse when I was going to get away from the big house. Manzano implored the saints to intercede on his behalf as he charted an escape route from the Matanzas slave plantation to the city of Havana circa 1817. Manzano had entered into a spiritual covenant with, quote, the saints of his devotion, so that, as he wrote in his autobiography, quote, so that the next day would not be as adverse as the last, end quote. If some misfortune befell Manzano, he wrote that he attributed it to my lack of devotion or to the anger of some saint whom I have forgotten for the next day. Although Manzano prayed to the most miraculous of saints, there is a particular saint the slave narrative mentions by name, San Antonio, Saint Anthony. Regarding San Antonio, I'll use Saint Anthony and San Antonio interchangeably, just a Spanish translation to English. Manzano wrote, quote, "In that way, I knew the lives of all of the most miraculous saints and the prayer verses of the Novena of St. Anthony. The saints are dramatis personae in Manzano. They reward piety and punish apathy. They are generous, yet easily angered. They might cause injury, but are not inherently evil." Manzano's reference to an ostensibly with Hail Marys and the Lord's Prayer should not be interpreted as faithful adherence to church doctrine. Manzano's relationship to the saints was anything but orthodox, as 19th century Cuban novelist Francisco Calcaño contended. Just going to grab my glasses here. I apologize. In his 1886 book, Poets of Color, or Poetas de Color, Francisco Calcaño accused Manzano of religious fanaticism. Manzano era devoto con aquella devoción de las personas ignorantes de su época. Manzano was devout, had devotion mixed with fanaticism of the ignorant people of his time, end quote. Calcaño was a white abolitionist who regarded Manzano as a meek and ignorant person who practiced a form of devotion mixed with fanaticism. Fanaticism is characterized by excessive enthusiasm and unreasoning zeal. Calcaño was not critical of Manzano's faithfulness to the official religion of the empire. After all, Calcaño was a practicing Catholic himself. But rather, Calcaño was suspicious of the way Manzano engaged the spiritual realm. Manzano's religious reasoning, his perception of spiritual phenomena, and his zeal offended white sensibilities. Mixed is the operative word in Calcaño's phrase, devotion mixed with fanaticism, because it implies the transculturation of Catholic and African-inspired practices. In Manzano's religious belief structure, as I will demonstrate later. But Calcaño was not alone. Cuban priest and abolitionist Felix Varela did not regard superstitious individuals simply as unenlightened believers. Nearly a half century prior to Calcaño's assertions about Manzano, Varela insisted that superstitious people had proclaimed themselves oracles, and that word is important. That is, vessels for contact with the other world. In ancient Greece, an oracle was a person through whom the gods were believed to convey hidden messages. Varela's choice of language is revealing. He regarded supersticiosos as individuals who had deliberately concocted a set of beliefs and practices that differed from the church and even defied its authority. Varela inveighed against the superstitious, writing the following. Quote, "In the nations where the only true religion has been established, which is Catholicism, her divine origin demands that there be one divine modus operandi, and this cannot be found in the vicissitudes, the limitations, and the whims of human understanding. The principle of authority is fundamental. There isn't a saint to whom they do not attribute a multitude of unheard wonders, and there is a sort of religious vanity and competition that becomes a part of this. Sometimes they try to present the saints as rivals to see which saint does the most miracles. This designation gives way to many lies and more foolishness than you can imagine, resulting in a mystical battle that is not only ridiculous, but also sacrilegious, because it is a sacrilege to treat the servants of God that experience him eternally in such a way. They, the saints, cannot be accomplices of such criminal and foolish individuals," end quote. Now, Varela was very important. He was a Cuban who was said to have taught Cubans to think. He was at the head of what we might call the progressives or the liberals of his time. He was against slavery, although Felix Varela did propose that the slave owners receive money for having held enslaved people. But he was an abolitionist. He was sent into exile by the Spanish authorities. Varela was also the individual who was effectively the mentor for Domingo del Monte. Del Monte was the prominent white, I wouldn't call him so much, he wasn't so much an abolitionist, but he was a patron of the humanities, and he was very important in Manzano's development, as we'll see later. Varela acknowledged that Cuban spirituality had taken a turn for the miraculous. Cubans believed in the saints as mystical entities that possessed great powers and performed, quote, unheard of wonders, end quote. They existed in a metaphysical universe rife with conflict and rampant rivalries. Cubans were aware of these metaphysical realities, and they strove to appease the most miraculous saints to empower themselves. Practitioners pursued saints that would guarantee the highest return on their investment and would triumph in mystical battles, quote, end quote, over otherworldly foes. Colonial Cubans sought after spiritual powers that might protect them from their adversaries, ward off evil influence, in Spanish it's called cosa mala, evil thing, and ultimately bring them success. But Varela did not direct his criticism to any particular ethno-racial community, which suggests that Cubans of African and European descent reveled in the miraculous nature of the saints, nor did he mention Manzano by name. Despite the prevalence of so-called superstition among myriad ethnicities in late colonial Cuba, Catholics and Protestants alike racialized the discourse of superstition. This process of othering began in the early colonial period. Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and the English reduced an array of Amerindian and African religious practices to a racialized assortment of pre-modern nonsense. In this lecture, I identified the corpus of religious practices that Felix Varela regarded as doctrinal aberrations, because my analysis of these practices will enable the reader to decode Manzano's representation of African-inspired spirituality. Father Varela, three forms of superstition that plague Cuban society. First, we have the emphasis on miraculous saints. Secondly, the abundance of spirit apparitions. People talk about spirit. And finally, the premonitory dreams. They were very concerned about these dreams because people would take those dreams to be revelations, perhaps from a deceased relative or another spiritual entity that they could not account for. The Catholic Church investigated miracles to determine their veracity. My lecture will analyze the emphasis on miraculous saints not as beneficent servants of the Christian God, but rather as transculturated beings commingling Christian and Yoruba spiritual characteristics to create a third ritual space. I want to give us an opportunity to understand, know a little bit more about Juan Francisco Manzano. I like to compare him to Frederick Douglass. I call him a Cuban Frederick Douglass, which might be slightly unfair to Manzano because he published his slave narrative in English translation in 1840, and he's believed to have completed it, some say in 1835, I believe it was 1836. And so Douglass publishes after Manzano, 5 years after Manzano, his first of 3 narratives. But Manzano is important because he produced the only self-authored slave narrative by anyone in Spanish America. Manzano produced a biography, a few letters, and a theatrical piece on slavery in North Africa titled Safira. His poetry appeared frequently in 19th century Cuban newspapers, making him a prominent literary figure. He published over his writings traversed 2 continents. His work was translated in French scholar, and with his name, so I'm going to leave his name alone.
I think you need to move a little bit.
Oh, okay. So that the sound is better?
Yeah, no, it's just exactly that side.
Okay.
You have to move that all the way.
Okay. I'll stay close enough to the...
No, it's in that box.
Oh, I see. Okay, so that's better. Is that better? Okay, thank you. Thank you for letting me know. In this lecture, it is my argument that Juan Francisco Manzano did not credit the clemency of the Christian God for his escape from the plantation. Rather, he boasted that the saints had made his escape possible, and he named St. Anthony, San Antonio, chief among them. Africans and their Cuban descendants use images of Catholic saints as camouflage for divine spirits known in Yoruba spirituality as orishas. While Catholic saints are known for their moral character and their unadulterated devotion to the Holy Faith, orishas constitute the interplay between good and evil. Cuban scholar Natalia Bolivar explains that orishas do not embody good and evil as absolutes. Rather, they personify the relationship between positive energies and destructive force. Since there cannot be peace without discord, and there is no safety without danger, I contend that Manzano transculturated St. Anthony, the Iberian Catholic saint, with the legua, the Yoruba spirit of the Crossroads, to harness the power necessary to liberate himself. For Manzano, fate was more than a conventional literary trope born of Spanish Romanticism. So throughout his life, Manzano wrote about fate. He would write about it to Domingo del Monte, who was the white reformist who wanted to end the slave trade, who invited him to write his slave narrative in exchange for his freedom. And he tells del Monte at one point in 1834, un vaso de lágrimas que derramar a los pies de la fortuna. I need a goblet of tears to well at destiny's feet, because destiny is the arbiter of all things. But for Del Monte, this notion of fate, for Manzano, this notion of fate was far more spiritually significant. There's a scholar by the name of Sweeney. She's one of the few scholars that's actually tackled the idea of non-normative religiosity in the literature of Juan Francisco Manzano. In her article, Atlantic Countercultures and the Network Text. And she says very briefly, quote, the existence of hierarchies in Catholicism, the tendency of these same hierarchies not only to mask the presence of other belief systems, but also frequently to encourage their absorption and continuity beneath a common religious umbrella, and a tendency towards mysticism and or the non-rational with an emphasis on ritual. These are characteristics of the way that Catholicism functions, so that Protestants would say the Catholics are superstitious and that they are irrational, much in the way that Calcaño said Manzano was. But what Sweeney calls masking might be better described as transculturation. Sweeney and other scholars acknowledge that throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, persons of African descent encoded African-inspired religious beliefs in the symbolic practice of Catholicism, and Catholic saints provided a remarkably fertile terrain for what Cuban scholar Fernando Ortiz characterized as transculturation. Working book and his groundbreaking book, Cuban Counterpoint, Tobacco and Sugar, published in 1940, Fernando Ortiz introduced transculturation as a neologism for theorizing the process whereby Europeans, indigenous Caribbeans, and Africans forged a third cultural space through their sustained, reciprocal, yet unequal interactions in the colonial era. Ortiz describes the process thus, quote, the two worlds mutually discovered and collided with each other, end quote. Ortiz did not disregard the effects of deculturation or acculturation. He acknowledged them. He said the contact of both cultures was terrible, quote, end quote. But Ortiz also insisted that colonized groups exercise a modicum of creative control to assign new meanings to hegemonic European practices, religious or otherwise. This is what scholar Mary Louise Pratt calls the intercultural nature of writing in the contact zone, where colonized subjects like Juan Francisco Manzano produce autoethnographic text. In autoethnographic text, symbols and images, like the Catholic saints, may mean one thing to a white Catholic readership, even as they allude to something altogether different for the African-descended interlocutor. enslaved Africans found themselves at the crossroads between the threat of complete deculturation and the adoption of a theoretically sophisticated alternative wherein they might maintain the epistemological core of their belief structure. Comparable to his enslaved African forebears, we believe Manzano's grandparents may have been African. Manzano was at the crossroads, and he understood that creative control was a proxy for political power. Manzano's relationship to the saints was premised on reciprocity and reiteration. He theorized that the appropriate acts of reverence would persuade the saints to intervene on his behalf, but that any lack of devotion might engender resentment and embitter them toward him. Manzano spoke about, revered, and otherwise engaged the saints in ways very consistent with an African Atlantic pattern of ritual and reverence and reciprocity. His belief that the saints were well disposed toward him is evidenced in the section below. I'll read this now, but I'll show it to you later in longer form. Quote, I only attributed it to my lack of devotion or to the anger of some saint whom I had forgotten for the next day. I still believe they, the saints, afforded me the occasion and watched over me the night of my escape from Matanzas to Havana, as we shall see. Taking up the almanac, all the saints of that month were prayed to daily by me, end quote. Manzano employed what I have termed liturgical ambiguity as one of the most important rhetorical devices for his representation of personal acts of piety. In the aforesaid passage, Manzano attributed his successful escape from Matanzas to the saints, not to Jesus Christ or God the Father. This attribution of responsibility situates the saints at the center of Manzano's ritual praxis. The emphasis on todos los santos is so broad as to be hyperbolic. The text lends itself to a certain opacity because no Catholic saint appears by name. As the Spanish saying goes, se cuenta el milagro pero no el santo. Tell the deed, not the doer. The saints performed three duties in Manzano's escape. They afforded him the occasion to run away, they protected him from fugitive slave hunting parties, and they secured his passage from Matanzas to Havana. After his mother's precipitous death, Manzano found himself at the crossroads. He was situated between freedom and slavery, life and death, the creative force of an emancipatory poetics, or the compulsory silence of the plantation. In African cosmologies, the crossroads are envisaged as a spirit that governs the meeting of disparate worlds, linking spirit with flesh and human need with divine power. In Nigeria, among Yoruba speakers, the crossroads spirit is known as Eshu Elegbara. Nigerian scholar Toyin Falola describes Eshu as a divine messenger, a mediator between the supreme deity and humanity. Falola brings clarity to the problem of Eshu's ambivalence and speaks to the conceptual confusion that ensues when Judeo-Christian worldview see him as the devil. So Eshu is here on the right, represented as a child, and this is St. Anthony, and this is the transculturation that took place in Cuba among the Yoruba, but perhaps also among some of the other African groups. Cubans, it wasn't right, but Africans, I should say, enslaved Africans created brotherhoods. So the brotherhoods that enslaved Africans created had two origins. They have origins in the lodges that existed in West Africa and places like Calabar, what is now Nigeria, but they also existed in Europe. In Spain and Seville, you had Christian brotherhoods, right? So you have the African brotherhoods in places like that are not Christian in any respect, and then you had the Christian brotherhoods that were created first in Portugal and then in Spain. I've been able to see some of those brotherhoods in both Seville and in Lisbon. I only mention that because those are the spaces where Africans presented with images of the Virgin Mary, presented with the saints, told to pray to those saints in an environment like Cuba where there were very few priests, began to change their processions, and instead of doing processions with images of the Orishas, they changed and they began to present images of the Catholic saints in order to avoid problems with the Catholic Church. The type of literature that Manzano wrote, I argue in my book, Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, is transculturated colonial literature. So it's written in the idioms of Spanish Catholic culture, or it uses European literary tropes. It's situated on the periphery, but it's palatable to a metropolitan audience. So someone like Domingo del Monte, who was securing Manzano's freedom, could read it, not think too much of it. Manzano doesn't mention the saint in his letters to Del Monte. He just, God has given me much purer soul than others. It is literature that is suffused with African-inspired epistemology, his engagement with the saints, the notion that they might punish him, and it subverts the inherent meanings of Catholic symbolism and literary tropes. And there are many examples of it. I'm only engaging one of those today. But I'd like to show you, this reference to a shoe, which I believe I have right here, from Falola. Quote, a shoe does not seek to destroy the bad and malevolent so that only the good and benevolent remain. Rather, a shoe sees the positive in both forces. A shoe, unlike the biblical Satan, does not work in opposition to God's plan for humankind. Neither does a shoe have the mission to completely destroy. Thus, seeking his equivalence in Christianity, as many have done, when they compare a shoe with the New Testament Satan, is very much misguided. A shoe is not the embodiment of evil, and he has no conceptual parallel in Christianity. Rather, a shoe poses a different kind of problem, because his mission is neither to destroy humanity nor to annihilate his spiritual counterparts in the Yoruba pantheon. Neither does a shoe pursue the ultimate annihilation of evil. Falola contends that a shoe acknowledges both good and evil as useful universal forces. Kola Abimbola further delineates how Christian and Yoruba conceptions of evil diverge. Abimbola reminds us that in Anglo-Protestant theology, the devil is the source of all evil. Satan is the antithesis of the Christian God, an entity that entices and persuades humans into an improper conduct. Conversely, in Yoruba religion, evil does not emanate from a shoe, but rather from more than 200 malevolent forces embedded within the spirit world, known in the Yoruba language as Agojun. That's A-G-O-G-U-N. Abimbola termed this understanding of maleficence within Yoruba cosmology as a polydemonic conception of evil. So he's using the language demon, but he's using it for heuristic purposes. So instead of there being a fear of the devil itself, the devil did not exist in traditional African cosmologies, rather the notion that evil is everywhere, that it is pervasive, and that good cannot exist without evil. Maureen Warren Lewis explains the philosophical problem of good and evil in pre-colonial African societies beyond the cultural boundaries of the kingdoms of the Yoruba. She writes that traditional African notions of good and evil in clan-centered societies posited goodness as that which enhances communal interests, whereas in Christianity, goodness is a transcendent ethos, contingent neither on context nor. Manzano's perception of the problem of evil is consistent with Abimbola's notion of a polydemonic conception of evil, quote, end quote. Manzano believed that he had fallen prey to malevolent forces that he referred to as cosa mala, evil thing. As such, he evoked this dreadful notion of evil when the overseer had confined him to an abandoned slave plantation full of African corpses. In this same vein, his mother recited the proverb, God can do more than the devil. She sought to embolden her son's quest to end the overseer's abuse and emancipate himself. Thus Manzano and his mother pursued goodness for their clan, and they perceived the problem of evil in terms of their family's captivity and the physical cruelty they had both suffered at the hands of their enslaver. Therefore, Manzano beseeched what Solimar Otero called the entities of the Crossroads, so they might open the path for him to emancipate himself. So I make the argument that Manzano's concern with evil thing or cosa mala is not the same thing as him being concerned with the devil. Fernando Ortiz says in his book, The Black Witch Doctors, and his other work, that cosa mala in Spanish is synonymous with evil spirit or duende. So the Spanish are using Catholic conceptions to understand this. But Lidia Cabrera further explores Cuban ideas of malevolence in her groundbreaking book El Monte, and she characterizes La Cosa Mala, evil thing, as maleficent dark spirits that have bad intentions. All the strange people in the other world, phantasmal and horrible to see, that inhabit the forested wilderness. So they're both talking about this in terms of spirits, but the interesting thing that happens with Cabrera's work is she talks about those that have bad intentions. So Manzano is concerned with those who have bad intentions, like his enslaver, who had committed not only physical but sexual violence against him, like his enslaver, who refused to give him the monies that his mother had bequeathed him, or to pay the debt she had to his family. I also explore that in the book. As to Cuban festival practices of expelling the devil, expulsions of diablos or cosa mala, when he described the collective removal of communal sin. And he said effectively that Catholic notions of evil and African notions of evil are transculturated to create a new understanding. See if we can look a little bit more here. Here's the Crossroads. This is an image actually out of Mississippi Blues. And so I argue that Manzano found himself here and had to effectively make some very important decisions. Because the Legua opens and closes the Crossroads. Okay. As I move towards the end here, I want to talk a bit more about the spirit of the Crossroads. Formerly enslaved Africans devoted to divine spirits known as Orishas explain the relationship between St. Anthony and the Legua to Cuban scholar Lidia Cabrera in these words. For depths of the Lucumi religion, the fortune teller, proprietor of herbs and of the forested wilderness of flora, is Osain, Josai. They used to pronounce it Adayi, Catholicize St. Anthony Abad and St. Silvestre, and one of the many names or paths of Elegua, Elegbara. Cabrera's informants characterize St. Anthony of Padua and St. Anthony Abad as names or paths of Elegua, the Yoruba spirit of the Crossroads. By describing St. Anthony as a Catholicized name for Elegua, they tacitly acknowledge that by 1954, when Cabrera published the book El Monte, the transculturative processes that Africans had initiated in the mid-18th century in Havana religious confraternities or cabildos have fully coalesced, so that, as Ortiz explained, transculturation produced new social meanings. In contradistinction to Francisco Calcaño, who said Manzano's work was mixed with fanaticism, or Father Felix Varela, who said that the superstitious wanted to make themselves into oracles, Manzano engaged the spirit world through an African-Cuban cultural lens, which, unlike European philosophy, is not premised on the principle of non-contradiction. St. Anthony is Elegua, and Elegua is St. Anthony. But Elegua was no easy saint to please. His mischief was such that if not properly propitiated, he might become jealous and be given to violence. Manzano acknowledged that his suffering was attributable to his lack of devotion, quote, end quote, or the antipathy of some saint that he had neglected. It is this St. Anthony that Manzano had to placate, so that the crossroads of potentialities might be open to him and make freedom possible. And the autobiography, Entreaty, is more than supplication, because the author pursued reconciliation with the saints through judiciously prescribed ritual activities. If Manzano's letters to Del Monte are read alongside the author's relationship to St. Anthony, however, the romantic notion of fate is divested of its normative meaning. Fate held the poet in contempt. It made him an object of mockery and scorn, so that as he told Del Monte in an 1834 letter, he wept at destiny's feet. Manzano's description of destiny as the arbiter of all things in the aforesaid letter makes fate comparable to his conception of the saints. But Manzano was faced with yet another crossroads. He could embrace the Christian redemptive narrative that promised to save the soul, but leave the black body enchained. Or he might seek to procure the power necessary to liberate himself from African-Cuban ritual. The Christian God is not a redemptive figure in Manzano's poetry and prose, but rather a source of suffering that has endowed the poet with a righteous, enduring soul. So he says in one of the letters, quote, "I yearn for many things, but I console myself when I consider that God has given me this disgrace, and also a soul that makes me superior to others, that without the slightest care mock me," end quote. In Manzano's liturgy, San Antonio and Legua embodied the Yoruba conception of destiny, individual chance and uncertainty in the quotidian struggle to survive and prosper. He was a paradoxical figure, empowered to open or close the crossroads, and he had to be placated lest the poet's destiny be adverse. Cuban scholar Rómulo Lachatañere argued that African-inspired spirituality constituted a coherent system of practices pursuant to its own logic. Moreover, Lachatañere renamed Yoruba-inspired religion Santeria, a term you may have heard, or worship of the saints, to do away with Ortiz's racialized idiom, witchcraft, or brujeria in Spanish. Lachatañere, a black Cuban scholar, corrected Ortiz's earlier work, the work that Ortiz did prior to 1940 when he came up with the language of transculturation. Lachatañere described the Legua as the owner of the crossroads, the caminos in Spanish, which are the four corners of the universe in African cosmologies. If a Legua closes the crossroads, he impedes contact with other divine entities and may eliminate personal aspirations. A Legua requires appropriate sacrifice to open the crossroads, thus enabling the adepts to achieve equilibrium within the uncertainty of human existence. In terms of Manzano's narrative, however, San Antonio's transculturation with the Legua may be explained by the fact that both divine personages are skilled travelers, capable of powers and alleviating personal woes. I want to give you one more passage I believe I have here from Manzano. So this is the principle of non-contradiction. I like that. Where Manzano writes at the end of the slave narrative, I'll make sure I give you the English. Manzano described it thus: "Me puse de rodillas, me encomendé a los santos de mi devoción, me puse el sombrero, monté cuando iba a andar para retirarme de la casa. I knelt down and I commended myself. I knelt down and I commended myself to the saints of my devotion. I put my hat on and mounted the horse when I was going to get away from the house." So no time within the slave narrative or in his poetry that I've discovered over many years of research does he attribute Jesus Christ or God the Father with escape from the plantation, which was the most significant thing he needed to do because his mother had entrusted him to become a father to his offspring once his father passed. In conclusion, a Legua is a decisive factor in Manzano's successful escape from the slave plantation. In Cuba, this Orisha is known as a Legua Echu, a paradoxical manifestation of the same spirit who interferes in all manners, human or divine. As a proprietor of the passageway, a Legua is an indispensable Orisha, so that nothing is possible without its involvement. The details of Manzano's escape are unknown, since the second part of his slave narrative was either lost or destroyed while in the possession of Ramon de Palma. Whatever the particulars of his escape, running away meant the very real possibility of death. Since the Legua is a near omniscient warrior spirit who possesses knowledge of Creator, of other Orishas, and of Egun, spirits of the dead, in Yoruba, Manzano performed the rituals to please God's secretary, quote, end quote. A Legua represents Manzano's hopes to be free, and he signifies a very real possibility that he may fall into the hands of the authorities. Manzano reasoned that the saints would perform what Felix Varela mocked as unheard of wonders, quote, end quote, if he could only distinguish the most miraculous saints from the rest and show them the requisite devotion. St. Anthony is the only saint he engages in a spiritual way throughout the narrative. He only mentions two, St. Gregory and St. Anthony, and he mentions St. Gregory in the context of his mother's death and a mass, a St. Gregory Mass being done for her. So he's not engaging St. Gregory ritualistically. But just as a Legua's Janus-faced ritual objects gaze in different directions, the Orisha may look upon Manzano with generosity and transmit his prayers to the supreme deity, or an alternative scenario could emerge in which Elegua disregarded devout prayers, provided no assistance, and left Manzano to fend for himself. For this very reason, the poet endeavored not to offend the Orishas through a perceived lack of devotion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We open now the floor for questions. If you would like to, I don't know, go into any of the topics, especially concepts that Dr. Pegway was touching.
It was clear.
Any questions? Okay, I do have one.
Okay.
Yeah, no, but for me, this is basically the topic that because when researching is African spirituality, but Afro-diasporic spirituality. So it's for me, it's fascinating that like transculturation. Okay, so this is what the tool that is giving us, but this, what you did with Manzano is autobiography. So it's it happens to me. In literature, have you analyzed this topic in literature, in fiction, let's say? Because I don't know if you have any other, because for me, I don't do non-fiction, so it's more in that.
I work largely with 19th century. My initial body of work, I'm beginning a new body of work on Brazil, but my initial body of work was about 19th century Black Cuban authors, broadly defined. And they were usually poets. I think because poetry was the most accessible thing to them. Also because they were coming from a series of a kind of a confluence of oral cultures, or cultures with a strong oral component. Because the Spanish have several forms like the decima, there's 10 verses, octosyllabic verses that they perform. And so blacks use those, whites use those. Those decimas were used to spread Catholicism to the non-literate in colonial Cuba. So I have seen this, what I'm calling transculturated colonial literature, in the work of Juan Francisco Manzano and his poetry and his slave narrative, his prose. And I've also found it in the work of Gabriel de la Concepcion Valdez, but also a poet, and he was exclusively a poet. But in Plácido, or Gabriel de la Concepcion Valdez, was a contemporary of Manzano. And so they initially, I don't want to get too far away from your question, but they were operating in separate spheres. Plácido was born free like Martin Delany, and Manzano was formerly enslaved, now making a name for himself as a writer, as a poet. And they meet, the two meet, and they begin to kind of have conversations and conspire, and they become involved in this anti-slavery conspiracy, both of them. And the book ends with that. But I have found that first generation of Manzano and Plácido are writing in this way with double meaning, but not in all their texts. I haven't seen it in, there's one example of it in 19th century Cuban literature, and that would be Cecilia Valdez, which is the national novel of Cuba. There's a moment there where I think La Señora de la Regla, we have to forgive all these Catholic references. Yes, all these references, but essentially this is the patron saint. Oh no, the patron saint now is Ochun, but this was a very important Catholic saint in Western Cuba, in the colonial period. And that saint has been transculturated, I believe, with Yemaya. So I saw it there in fiction, but it's not typically there. And then there's a third poet, Jose de Carmen Diaz, who also uses this. He has a poem called The Cemetery on the Sugar Plantation. And he uses that form, the decima, those 10 octosyllabic verses that are supposed to be improvised. You're supposed to come up with it like that, like rapping on the spot, but you have to do it in a certain form. And he tells the story of different enslaved people. And there's one moment he talks about Juan el Congo, and the way in which he engages Juan el Congo, the way he talks about the tomb, I argue that there are some Congo markers there. But it's very subtle. It's meant for those two audiences. To be palatable, like, son cosas de negros, it's just black, it's nothing, you know? Or this is how wonderful, you know? And at the same time to speak to another audience. And that's the way that the Cubans operated. So we rarely find, even in the archive, someone saying, I am a servant of Shango, you know? Even when they know they're going to be executed, there's like maybe one or two examples we have found that are that clear. Mm-hmm.
And even you were mentioning, which is recent, if you...
Yes. 20th century, yeah.
Exactly. And even for her, she would say, no, these are for black people,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever. But when she was trying to research on that, there were people who were against. I open the floor now. Any other questions?
Yes.
Hello.
How are you doing? Good to meet you. Can you tell the audience who you are and what you do?
I'm Yete, and I'm originally from New York. I've lived in Cape Town for 6 years, and I'm head of a multinational spiritual house. I'm also an initiate of Shamanism, so this is particularly important for me. So my question is,
Yes.
in regards to the syncretic societies that you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
were you specifically alluding to the cabildos? And if so, like Abaqua and so on, if so, that leads to my next question. So you were in Spain and in Lisbon.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of parallels did you observe with regards to the societies that you in Europe?
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you for that question. So I'll go back, give a little bit more background, because I realize I'm in Southern Africa, and you have the Nguni traditions here, so which I look forward to learning about. So thank you very much for coming, Baba Siete. So yes, so I'll say this: Portuguese and Spanish law allowed for, I don't want to call these rights, I'm not sure if you can say that enslaved people had rights in any form, but allowed for the creation of religious confraternities. They were meant to provide a space for enslaved people to commune with Catholicism to become better Catholics. But they largely ran these on their own. At least this was the case in Cuba. They ran these on their own. And so behind closed doors, they had their own, corporate structures. They would have a king, they would have a queen. They had their own songs, and they kept the tradition alive. So that's what those societies were. They were called cabildos, which is a Spanish word that often refers, I believe, like to el ayuntamiento. Yeah, what's the word for that? Is it city hall or something like that? Basically, but yeah, alcaldía. Yeah, but it was supposed to be a government body, the cabildo. I was referring to the cabildos. I want to say this briefly, but hopefully this will spark greater understanding. These societies were very important, and you had the cabildos, which were run by Africans, that Africans governed, and then you also had the cofradías. These were another form of brotherhoods, also in Spanish America, and the priests were more closely associated with those. So it was possible to be in the cofradía and to be Catholic. It's not that it was impossible to be black and to be Catholic, but in Cuba they would say, yo soy católico, pero yo soy católico a mi manera. I'm Catholic, but I'm Catholic my own way. So yes, I was referring to those societies. Seville, to research those societies or to do much more than the kind of the basic tour. But the tour guide that I had in Lisbon was one of the best tour guides I've ever had. And he was a brother from Togo, and he explained, he done a lot of archival research about slavery in Portugal and the Portuguese world, and he would come with his documents. He would have you read the primary source. He was very calm, polyglot, but he didn't have any information. And so I don't know what type of work has been done. However, Madrid and Malaga, Spain. And so I would like to ask the Spaniards what information they may have about that. Spain and Portugal in particular, is that they act as if slavery happened elsewhere. book, and really as a Black American, you can look at them like, really? Because they have the monuments, the discoverers, you know. But that's not so different than the American empire, is it? You know, monuments to the discoverers. So I don't know if within those societies we have transliteration of it throughout the Americas. So with the version of and in African or Black confraternities in America, well, the version of special meaning, she's a sister. And so there, and we say there was. I hope that helps. Look forward to more conversation. I believe you. Any and all questions?
Hi.
Can you give me your name again? Lebo.
Yeah. Thank you. That was so fascinating. And I think I have two questions.
Okay.
The one is around just the archive.
Okay.
Manzano's archive, the poetry, the letters, the accession history.
Okay.
You know, these documents, how they've been put together by whom and how, and particularly the letters that he wrote. That there was a process of their collection, so, and how, you know, how was that done and when?
Okay.
And then I was sort of interested in, I mean, I think in your talk, you seem to suggest that there are kind of different presentations of himself.
Of Manzano?
Of himself
Okay.
in the different genres.
Oh, okay.
Of writing, right? Manzano in the letter, and also the letter to whom it's written, versus Manzano autobiographically and Manzano in his poetry. And I'm wondering if you can talk, is this what I'm reading in your presentation, does it really exist? Is it something that you've explored and the kind of, the performances of self or the presentations that emerge, and where they are most reconciled?
What do you mean most reconciled?
Where they seem to all come
Okay.
together.
Okay.
My final
Ooh, I like that
question
question.
is around, you know, you speak about the sort of African spirituality, but also sort of Christianity, and, you know, sort of the time period of Spanish conquest is sort of also happening around the ejection of basically Jews and Christian India from the, not Jews and Muslims in the Iberian coast. And we know of Islam, particularly with the Haitian Revolution, and I'm wondering, is Islam somewhere here? Has Manzano referred to Islam? Basically, is there Islamic something? I don't know whether it is influenced or not.
That's very.
It's like all thinking in his letters around where Islam sits in this kind of
I like this. This is the kind of engagement and conversations I dreamt of coming to Africa. First time in Southern Africa, the continent, but first time in Southern Africa. So Lebu, I want to start with the question concerning the archive. The archive is very important. I have a piece coming about actually. I'll present it at Pretoria, and I engage the archive in that particular article. But there's probably more that needs to be written about it. Maybe there's some graduate student that will do it, or someone will oblige me to do it at some point. But the archive is very interesting. When you have those poems, read either as neoclassical, some could say bad neoclassical, or as romanticism, or some kind. In the Hispanic Caribbean, those two things combined, whereas in Europe, they were. So you have that. You have his letters. Monte's letters. Some letters he didn't dispatch, but there's 7. Nowhere to be found. It's believed that maybe that is the case because, as I said before, Manzano and Plasso got to know each other. These are African both poets, and they both become involved with different degrees. The last chapter of my book is about that, to different degrees. And Del Monte is involved because Del Monte is trying to get Placido to write incendiary poetry to get the blacks to rise up. so that he can then swoop in and take the lead, and because he's the good, or whatever he thought he was. But what happens is that when the Spanish get word of the uprisings, and the first uprising, because you want to talk about the black men and the black women together, in a couple African who leads on the plantation. Of course, many African men, of course, fighting as well, but I think it's really important to pinpoint to that. But so the archive is expansive for someone like Manzano. The letters of Del Monte don't survive. We believe that don't survive because Del Monte destroyed them, we believe, to protect himself. He escaped to Paris. I'll let you do with that whatever you may. In terms of the process of collection, this is where the white literati played a very important historical role. Not only appears to have resisted writing because of the trauma and the shame. Letters to the Monte says, I don't know about writing this, I don't know if I should tell you this. It may affect the way, et cetera, et cetera. But they keep his writings, they keep the slave narrative. So we have the manuscript. His name is not on it, once again, probably to protect himself, but he didn't sign it. But they have Europe to London first, and then they Irish, important Irish abolitionists. So we have that part of his archive, and then we have his poetry. And so the poems are interesting. A lot of them do appear to be period poems. But then Manzano had a way of playing. I think he was a narrator because he not necessarily become. He wanted to be a poet. He dreamt of writing a novel, which he didn't get the chance to do. But he really wanted to be a poet. That was the thing. There really weren't much novelists. Most people couldn't read and write, black or white. That will come as no surprise. Very different than African Islamic societies where most people could read and write. A lot of people don't realize that. But in terms of different presentations of himself, in the slave narrative, there's a transformation. In my book, we'll go into that in detail because he apparently beloved child, considered a little mulatto, and then, at some point, and I try to explain why that shift is important in black maleness, right? Where now, she wanted to prevent him from becoming a poet. Everyone told him, don't learn to read and write. You're going to be like worse than Voltaire and Rousseau. That's what they told him. So he has a certain kind of fondness for so-called good masters, fear of the bad mistress, right? But a desire to please. Then he has a moment where his mother is very, his mother says, "Look, you're right. You need to become a too." Then you have that. And so I say that to say that later he produces some poetry that reflects an anti-slavery viewpoint once he escapes the slave plantation. So once he gets off the slave plantation, he's able to produce different type of literature. And it's beautiful. Dream to My Second Brother. And he names his brother and dedicates it to his brother. His name is mentioned twice. And he does a ritual in the poem. He turns into a bird, he's spinning in the air, he lands in the center of the earth. So in that poem, his brother, a robust Ethiopian, it's very, very interesting what he does. He says the Christian God knocks him out of the air and he falls like Icarus. I'm trying not to give too many details, but it's almost impossible to talk about Manzano without providing some detail. But I say that to say that I think he was not all that different than other colonized subjects. He's traumatized to the extent that on one level, he knows the saints provided him the opportunity to escape, but he also knows and paid for it. Certain loyalty to Del Monte, even into his latter years. So when he and Blas, the tribunal, and they've got to own up. Manzano's trying to get out of it. Then his voice changed again. The joint interrogation, his voice changed again. He said, "Oh, we were just talking about some women and drinking." Probably was a bit more going on than that. So I say all that to say that his voice changes, the presentation itself throughout. Very briefly, your last question, something we could talk about another time. He did produce a play, interestingly enough, in North Africa, where he talks about, I think, the Amazigh slave traders and Arab slave traders, and he has a black hero in that poem, in that play. But I don't study that play myself. Others have. So I hope that wasn't a convoluted answer. I know that was long.
First seminar for the SFN Research Seminar Series, and we invite you for the 24th of March, also for next one. It's going to be on a Tuesday, only for the seminar, because usually we have them on Thursday. Now we invite you to upstairs to the common room to have some continue the conversation. Thank you very much, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, I can take this off. Thank you for your questions. ¿Te parece que fue claro?
Sabes que yo estaba en la calle. Ah, ok, no estaba tan equivocada. Mati piensa lo mismo. Mati piensa lo mismo. ¿Sabes que yo, sabes que ese trabajo de Schroeder
Let's go have tea. We're going to bring light meal now to upstairs, and then to Dark Horse. And we'll probably join what happens upstairs. And then go home and check that. Well, to bread pump. Okay.